Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Neoterran Capataline army. In this video, we're talking about who Neoterra are, how they play, what are their strengths, limitations, and faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through a whole bunch of the profiles that really show off this faction. Finally, we'll conclude with a list that brings a bunch of that together and demonstrates what some of that strength looks like in practice. Now, firstly, big thanks to the channel members that voted for Neoterra as the next faction focus. As a rule, I don't intend to ever do members-only content, but I do put video topics to vote to channel members, and in this case, Neoterra was overwhelmingly selected as the next army for a faction focus. If you'd like to vote in these polls when they arise, if you'd like to suggest channel topics or battle report armies, you can do so either by becoming a channel member on YouTube or by making a donation via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Now, plug over, let's talk about Neoterra. Neoterra are the army of the capital of Pan-Oceania, and that shows through both in their profiles and the mechanical identity of the faction. And they have just a laundry list of strengths that collectively combine to make them, in a sense, kind of the most Pan-Oceanian of the Pan-Oceanian sectorals. They have serious high watermark gunfighting, both in the active and reactive turn, and in fact this sectoral is home to the best in entire game ARO piece, which we'll talk about when we get through the army section. However, they're also not solely an elite army. Neoterra is very complete and has a really nice spread of points, all the way from fantastic expensive models, 70 points, 60 points, that kind of thing, through to great medium cost models in the 20 to 30 points range, down to really good cheap models as well. They've got availability 3 flash pulse remotes, Auxilla are fantastic, and that means they're a faction that has the infrastructure to support expensive stuff at list construction. They aren't locked into just cool, expensive things with no way to get orders and bulk into a list. They can, with a little bit of balance in your list construction, kind of have it all. They are, of all of the factions in Pan-Oceania, the one with the best access to Oxbots, which immediately endears them to me because Oxbots are wonderful and I love them. And as part of that infrastructure, there's a lot of things like tactical awareness in Neoterra, which means you will basically always have a very healthy order count if you want it. They've got good quality hacking, what I would call like top of the middleweight division hacking, where they're probably the second best hacking faction in Pan-Oceania next to Acontecimento, sitting only behind military orders, with that level of hacking that lets you basically choose how much you want to compete in that space, from a little up to a fair bit, although you won't, as Neoterra, reach the high watermark of hacking in the game. You can absolutely play in that space, which is really suited to their position as kind of a technology-focused army. They can make good use of a few small high utility fire teams. In particular, they have just a ton of wildcards. And then finally, and this is where we really get into what I would consider their primary strengths, they have a lot of units that are technologically very specialized. Units that are very good at one or two things, but which don't necessarily do much else. Not a lot of multi-role elements, but units that are very, very good inside their specialization. And this has a few impacts on how they play, and it's where we start to see their mechanical identity emerge. And the first thing from that kind of strength is that we get an army that really is peak Pan-Oceania. They're very good at playing what you would call the classic Pan-Oceanian game, the kind of game that Pan-Oceania has wanted to play for most of Infinity's life cycle. You want to use your powerful firepower pieces to suppress enemy AROs. You want to then move forward with elements that exploit the fact that enemy AROs are suppressed, whether that's to accomplish mission objectives or launch close assaults or pick apart the midfield. You want to eventually reach a point where you suppress the enemy guns entirely while your own ARO pieces remain intact, and that just gives you total control over the field to do whatever you need, and subsequently win the game. It's a very Pan-Oceanian style of play. Neoterra is very good at it. But beyond that, this emphasis on high quality specialized pieces in Neoterra creates an environment where they're very interesting as a faction for both new and experienced players. For new players, they're kind of a very good teaching faction. I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting the game with them completely, although you could. Kestrel is probably a better on-ramp for most players, but the reason why Kestrel is a good on-ramp is that it's a very smooth experience to start the game with. Kestrel, particularly at the list construction level, is generally fairly straightforward and rewarding and intuitive. It's basically very difficult to build a bad list in Kestrel Colonial Force if you kind of just follow what the faction looks like it's telling you to do. If you look at the fire team's charts and kind of just do that, you end up with, in Kestrel, a really solid list that plays well and will get you into the game. But once you kind of have your feet underneath you, Neoterra can make a really good next step in terms of your collection because of how it's very good at reinforcing lessons. That specialization, where you have firepower pieces that are very good at being firepower pieces, and specialists that are very good at being specialists but can't advance under their own power, and close assault and utility and rapid offensive units, all of these pieces where when they get to be lined up and do the thing that the profile really wants to do, excel, but don't necessarily want to do things outside of their core competency, what that will do is that it will really reinforce when you're doing the right thing and when you're doing the wrong thing. When you're using firepower pieces as firepower piece roles, when you're using specialized specialists to do specialist things, all of it works very, very smoothly. And so it's a faction that rewards bringing pieces to bear on the role they are best fit for, which will reinforce over time really effectively just kind of how to play Infinity in a fundamentally good way. Now, the corollary of that, of course, is that it tends to punish failure and bad decision making. You can't use an Auxilla or Shona Carano to gunfight any more than you can use a Swish missile launcher to press a button. But in terms of being a faction that really teaches you how to make those good fundamental decisions, Neoterra can be very good for players that have just progressed just beyond the new player kind of experience. And it transitions really well into a faction that is just very enjoyable for experienced players as well. Because all of that specialization, all of those good quality firepower pieces, good quality rapid offensive elements, close assault, utility, weirdly good button presses, decent quality hacking, all of that comes together to make Neoterra, for an experienced player, a faction that is just really good at giving you a feeling of power. Because provided you are in the right lane with all of these models in your army, they are just all in high gear. Inside their core competencies, a Swiss Guard, an Ulan, a Red Eye, even the humble Auxilla, Shona Carano, Pathfinder Dronbots, Bolts, these pieces are strong. And if you apply all of that force in the right way, the army just feels really, really good. Now, that's not to say that it's a faction with no limitations, but a lot of those limitations really just are the corollary to the strengths. All of those specialized units have a specialization, and if something goes wrong or one of them dies at the wrong place in the wrong time, building resiliency or redundancy into a list can be a little bit difficult. And particularly in the firepower space, this can be quite evident in some games. Neoterra does tend to be quite SWC or points limited for the really good pieces. And you're often going to find that any list you build will have 2 or 3 good quality guns. You can't really squeeze more into it than that. You can't have the mythical 4-gun or 5-gun army particularly easily, because the really good quality stuff is both very SWC and very points expensive, and even a lot of your kind of average quality guns still tend to be 1.5 SWC pieces, and you'll often want some hacking or spend some SWC here and there on other bits and pieces. And so you're often going to be in a position where maybe 3 firepower pieces are all you're going to get, and each of them will have different strengths and weaknesses. And if you play them well and use them correctly, that can absolutely be really, really excellent. But if one of them goes down to something that you didn't expect at the wrong place at the wrong time, and then another one gets unlucky, you might just find yourself in a position where a Red Eye is taking long-range gunfights because it's all you've got left to try and suppress enemy ARO pieces, and you can't advance unless you do that. And that's where we see Neoterra. It's peak Pan-Oceania in its strengths, but it's peak Pan-Oceania in its vulnerabilities. Neoterra is one of the factions in the game that can be vulnerable to what we would call Pan-Oceania lockout. And that's what happens when you have no visibility control and really not very much camouflage, and you have that one game in 10 or 20 or 50 where you just have a bunch of really bad luck. Where the Clausewitz Ulan faces off against an enemy missile launcher and it loses the face-to-face roll, then it takes 3 wounds, and then you burn through all of your command tokens and the machinist kills the damn thing. And all of that is shockingly unlikely, but we roll a lot of dice in Infinity and unlikely events do occur, and that's it. You kind of can't push forward anymore. Your Bolt Sniper is in the wrong position to try and engage the piece that you're looking to put down, and the whole turn, or potentially the whole game, begins to toilet bowl. And so a lot of learning how to play Neoterra and Neoterran list construction is getting what insurance we can against that happening, and learning the play patterns, particularly things like use of speedball, having the right engineers or other recurrence pieces in your list where you need them, right? Force reconstitution, taking gunfights under the best of circumstances, playing a Pan-Oceanian game becomes very important. There are a few other limitations that are kind of worth mentioning as well, but they take second fiddle to that. This is a faction with big Pan-Oceanian strengths and big Pan-Oceanian weaknesses. This is not generally a faction that has lieutenants I'm super excited by. This is a 2 Fusiliers or 2 Auxiliars in most lists. There are a few heavyweight pieces that you can take, but I don't really enormously recommend any of them particularly. You could access Chain of Command if you wanted to. Most of the time, it's just a couple of Fusiliers hiding in different corners of the table, and that's that. Not the end of the world, but it's something that is missing from the faction. And it's also, as noted, a faction that has very little visibility control. Technically, there are 2 profiles in Neoterra who have access to disco balls, but both of them are not particularly compelling. The first is a very, very expensive Aquilla guard with a multi-marksman rifle, which, yes, I suspect you could make work in some lists, but I would not really call him a factional strength. And then secondly, you have Richard Quinn, who, again, an expensive piece that's not really doing a terribly large amount, even if technically he is an amusing counter to Red Eyes. He is expensive enough and single wound enough and broadly low value enough that he's usually going to be left at home, which means that most Neoterra lists aren't packing visibility control, which means they aren't packing a plan B if firepower doesn't make the enemy sit down. Now, those are not the worst limitations to have, particularly given such a long length of cool and interesting skills that Neoterra has, but they are broadly things to be aware of. Overall, though, Neoterra is peak Pan-Oceania, as it absolutely should be. It's a faction that will let you flex Pan-Oceanian strengths, it's a faction that will force you to account for Pan-Oceanian weaknesses, and it's a faction that will scale very, very well from beginner intermediate all the way up to very experienced. If you have onboarded into Infinity with Kestrel Colonial Force, I can definitely recommend Neoterra as your second stop along the way. And as the very first faction of Infinity that I ever played, I'm very glad to see them back in the game. Now let's jump into Army and start slavering over some profiles. Now, normally out the gate, and even in a case like Neoterra, I would start with going through the links that you can build in a list. And we will get to them right after this, but I think it's important kind of just to emphasize at the very beginning how useful and effective and cost effective some of Neoterra's supporting infrastructure in a list is. I won't show them on screen, but you have availability 3 Fugazi drone bots. Those are the cheap flash pulse remotes. And the top end of Neoterra is cool and expensive enough that it really is a faction that can make excellent use even of AVA 3 of those Fugazi. You've got things like 9-point tech bees, which, given that we're often going to include a tag in a list, is very valuable. It's regular, it's a specialist. It has a gizmo kit and a deactivator and a deployable repeater. Again, cheaper than a Fugazi drone bot, excellent addition in many lists, and part of that supporting infrastructure that bulks our army out to 15 troopers, lots of regular orders, and still lets us take the cool and effective stuff. And then, to round out that trifecta, we have Auxilla. Auxilla are a defining strength of Neoterra. You probably shouldn't play a Neoterra list without at least 1 or 2 of these guys, and you can take a whole bunch more than that if you want to. Lord knows I have. I love myself some Oxbots, but a good number is 1 or 2 of these. At their core, an individual Auxilla is nothing terribly special, but they are cheap, and they are 2 troops for the price of 1, and that's just really good. Because we don't have access to warbands in this faction, because we don't have access to that many cheap irregulars we want to make a ton of use of, Auxilla are regular, and their Oxbots represent both a disposable assault piece if you really need it, and a disposable ablative defensive piece. All of the Oxbots have heavy flamethrowers. All of them do not cost you an order if they die. They're 5 to 7 points per Oxbot. The total package for an Auxilla pair is 15 to 18 points, which is very affordable, and an Oxbot with a heavy flamethrower is just one of the most effective corner guards in the game. There are very few things that really want to wear a heavy flamethrower if they can avoid it, and with both a 360 visor and mimetism -3, they're very difficult to unpick efficiently. Often you have to trade into an Oxbot, you can't sneak up behind it, and they can be annoyingly difficult to try and shoot down. And that makes just a couple of Oxbots a really valuable crumple zone for your army to make sure the expensive or important stuff is safe for at least 1 or 2 turns. On top of that, Auxilla are a serviceable lieutenant profile. Yes, we can equally often take Fusiliers, but if we take a couple of Auxillas, right, Auxillas with combi rifle and nanopulsers, one of them can be the LT. That gives you both a pair of Oxbots, which is nice, and theoretically gives you an order outlet for your lieutenant order, because you can always have, once you know they're safe, the lieutenant spend their order just to make the Oxbot go and do things. In the list at the end of this video, we'll be using Fusiliers as the lieutenant and decoy. That's a point consideration, but having the option to spend 10 points and upgrade those 2 Fusiliers to a pair of Auxilla gets you a fair bit of benefit. Finally, the actual most important thing that Auxilla do are they're just one of the best specialists in the game. Particularly this profile here, 15 points, Auxilla Forward Observer with Submachine Gun Flash Pulse, Deployable Repeater, actually genuinely nice, particularly given the Oxbot 2 it's packing around has a deployable repeater as well, which means you can place 2 deployable repeaters with 1 order, which if you are taking some hacking with this faction, genuinely very useful. But more importantly, the Auxilla is a forward observer, and the Oxbot is a forward observer. And what that means, if you move them into base contact with the same mission objective, each of them gets to declare the same roll, which means that each of them gets to make a roll against, say, turning on an antenna. And if both of them get to make that roll, you have an 82% chance to succeed. That's 0.40 times 0.45 chance to fail for those playing along at home. And an 82% success chance is better than being a willpower 16 specialist. That's excellent. Like, there's nothing in Panoceania that comes remotely close to that. Having, for 15 points, a model that is better at pushing buttons than an involved intelligence aspect is just an enormous deal, because for a very long time, one of the ways Panoceania could lose the game is to shoot all of the enemies to death, and then move forward, and then just fail 5 willpower 12 rolls in a row. And if you use Oxbots or Auxilla and their Oxbots as some of your active turn specialists, you have just such a high chance of succeeding on those rolls that even in scenarios without operative learning, you have in the back pocket one of the best specialists in the game. And so I have always loved Auxilla because the entire concept of Oxbots just tickles me. I enjoy them personally on like an aesthetic level, but they are very useful. They do a bunch of different things. They have defensive utility. They can establish a hacking network. They're very good at pressing buttons. And in an absolute pinch, you might even fork an attack between the flamethrower and the combi rifle, although as a general rule, that's probably one of the last things they want to be doing because it's one of the last things they will do. Auxilla are a core Neoterran strength, along with things like Tech Bees and AVA3 Fugazi, even just total availability or near total availability Fusiliers, which cover off on the core needs of a force cheaply and let you really flex the cool and expensive toys, which is just a very Panoceanian thing to do. And from here, we get into our actual links, which would usually be the bread and butter of a faction. And we start with Fusiliers, which are AVA 5. Now, in days gone by, the Fusilier core was to a greater or lesser extent a fairly important part of Neoterra. It's really not anymore. You should probably not be taking any of these other than, in some lists, a Fusilier Lieutenant and a Fusilier with Combi Rifle as a decoy. In a pinch, you can run a Fusilier Hacker if you really can't afford a slightly better quality hacker. Like a blocker, you could maybe run a Fusilier Paramedic in some cases if you really wanted to, but most of that supporting infrastructure of a list job is done by remotes or people carrying around remotes, and so Fusiliers have a much lesser role these days. As a lieutenant, totally fine. Lieutenant Decoy, totally fine, but you shouldn't, for example, be taking any of these SWC weapons, or even really any of the specialists in most of your lists. That's for other Panoceanian factions. And the reason why I say you probably shouldn't take a Fusilier hacker unless you're really squeezed on points is because of blockers, attached agents to the CDCI. Now, blockers aren't a wild card, but they almost may as well be because they can appear in our most common fire teams. And one of the very important things is that in a Fusilier fire team, they count as Fusiliers, and in a CSU duo, they count as CSUs, which means that it's very, very easy to get a fire team bonus onto a blocker, which is a really big deal because this is just some absolutely top shelf relative to cost hacking support. For only 19 points and half an SWC, which is criminally cheap, you get just about the perfect entry-level hacking in the entire game. You have a ballistic skill 12, ballistic skill attack +1 burst, easily linkable pitcher, which means that you have, with an X-Visor, you have just the best pitcher thereabouts in the game. And it's a hacker that natively has a firewall. Now, ballistics, so willpower 13 BTS 3 is not the end of the world, but it's 19 points and it's bringing its own pitcher, and it's such an outstanding pitcher. There's a limit to how much we can demand of this thing. It's also going to be able to fire off, if it wants to, ballistic skill attack +1 burst, it can fire off both of its pitches in one go with a special die, which means that if you've got a means of reloading it, it's just a very, very efficient way of distributing pitches wherever you need to. And on top of all of that, the damn thing just has a sensor for some reason, which is a very valuable piece of equipment these days. It's got a pulsar to defend itself at close range, it's got a flash pulse, it's just an intensely efficient profile, and you should probably have one of these in every Pan-Oceanian list. Not, like, obligatorily, but since you're often going to be taking things like Fugazi drone bots, you have a deployment zone repeater network. Since you're often going to be taking Auxilla, between the blocker and the Auxilla, you have ways of getting repeaters out there. And that means that if you never take an active turn hacking attack, if you only ever hack in ARO, even if you only ever spotlight in ARO, you're just getting a tremendous amount of value out of a model that costs less than 20 points. You can also use the blocker as the springboard to a list that reaches up toward that top of the middleweight hacking, because while a blocker itself is a serviceable enough regular hacker, there's actually some pretty good quality, pretty accessible killer hacking we have access to in this faction as well. We don't get up into the territory of things like Deferson or the Anathematic, but if we want to for relatively cheap, we can absolutely flex hacking into a Neoterran list, and doing that starts with blockers. Now, frankly, the easiest way to link a blocker is to take a Fusilier, take a Fusilier decoy. There you go. That's 2 Fusiliers and a blocker. That's minimum size for a fire team Haris or Core. And if they need to move up the field, you just leave one of the Fusiliers behind. Then it's a 2-person fire team core. It was formed legally, so that's okay. And that's all you need to get specialist bonuses because the blocker counts as a Fusilier, so it gets the +1 special die. If you want to add a gun, your options are more limited in a Fusilier fire team. There aren't that many wildcards we're terribly interested in that we want to put into a Fusilier team. There are a couple that we'll talk about, or you can add an Orc troop. Orcs have been around since the dawn of time. They are 6-2 move in this edition, and ballistic skill 14, armor 4, BTS 3. They have serviceable heavy weapons. The boarding shotgun is a surprisingly good close assault piece. There is nothing per se wrong with them, but this is Neoterra, and we have access to much more specialized pieces in our firepower role if we want them. And so, while an Orc heavy machine gun is actually kind of a fine option to add into the army if you want to, much of the time I'll just leave the Fusilier fire team without a gun and have it operate purely in a support and button pressing role, and get my guns from independent pieces or slightly more elite, if more fragile, linkable firepower options in the form of bolts. And bolts are where the fire teams begin to actually show their teeth a little bit more. A Neoterra bolt with multi-sniper is reasonably often going to be one of the main guns in your list. Not always. It is still a single wound piece, but the Neoterra bolt sniper at only 26 points is a very, very good gunfighter. It's subject to almost no modifiers in the game. It has marksmanship, so it doesn't suffer penalties from cover. It has Warhorse and an MSV1, so it doesn't suffer penalties from Mimetism 3 or from Ballistic Skill Attack -3. It only suffers penalties to hit from Albedo or Mimetism at the -6 level, and even then it reduces that. Or, of course, getting inside of its range. And that means that it's a model that's just very good at winning gunfights, and it's an MSV piece. Having any MSV piece at all in a list tends to just create situations where your opponent doesn't get to ignore your guns. Whether you're playing, like, whoever you're playing against, often smoke grenades are a means of getting in on midfield objectives and accomplishing stuff there, and having the Neoterra Bolt just gives you the option of saying, no, actually, you need either Eclipse or to take some casualties. And at 26 points, it's pretty efficient, even if the SWC cost is high. It also pairs quite nicely with many of the other gunfighting pieces that I'm going to recommend. Basically, all of the gunfighting pieces you're going to hear me gush about after this point will have at minimum Mimetism -3, and in several cases Mimetism -6. Having another gun in your army that isn't reliant on mimetism but is very good at ignoring negative modifiers just rounds out your firepower profile really nicely, which makes a Neoterra Bolt really nice. They're also very easy to link. There's a bunch of things we can add into them. We can get fireteam bonuses quite easily, even if that's just with one of the other profiles. And there are a bunch of profiles here that are really quite nice. There are some lists that will benefit from the Chain of Command profile. If you need it, that's where you find it in this faction. The Spitfire can be kind of valuable if you want a different kind of firepower profile, perhaps on a fire team that's moving much more aggressively up the field in certain missions, and basically any of the profiles that have a boarding shotgun +1 burst, whether that be the basic drop bear profile or the killer hacker or hacking device profiles. I kind of like all of those. Bolts are only willpower 12, but they're BTS 6 and are immunity to isolation thanks to Warhorse, which makes, for the cost, them fairly practical hackers. In a pinch, you can even fairly easily take the paramedic. 23 points is not unreasonable, but we will usually find other better ways to get specialist into a bolt fire team, be that a hacker or more often an interesting kind of wildcard. One option are NCA Machinist, which we can see on screen now, which count as a bolt, but there's another better option that will usually overshadow that for just a few more points. We'll talk about in the wildcard section. And so usually a Neoterra fire team will consist primarily of bolts with utility wildcards. Now, apart from the Ultima Ratio fire team, which is our tag file team, we'll talk about that when we get to the tags, there is one more fire team that's kind of worth mentioning, and that's the CSU fire team. These guys are cheaper than Auxilla, a little more expensive than Fusiliers, but they are a very accessible duo and can duo with a blocker. If, for example, you're taking Auxilla as your lieutenants and you still want a blocker to be linked, one CSU and one blocker is a legal duo that gets duo bonuses, and for 11 points, CSUs are totally fine. This is very much a building blocks of a broader list fire team, but it is something that's worth considering. Now from there, we get into the wildcards and things get pretty interesting here. In fact, this list is so long that we aren't going to cover everything, but we will go through a bunch of stuff, and we'll start with the Blade Ops. And there are two profiles here that we're particularly interested in. The bottom two profiles of the Blade Ops they're a bit more in what we might call meme profiles. They're not bad necessarily, but they're not really what we're particularly interested in. What we're interested in are the FTOs, where we have the choice either of a boarding shotgun or decharges and an AP submachine gun, both of which are fine weapon loadouts, as although this is a single wound trooper, it is Armor 2 BTS 3 with Mimetism and BS Attack -1 and Ballistic Skill 13. All of that's really solid, made even better by the fact that this is a tactical awareness model, and tactical awareness is the main selling point of the blade. In a Neoterra fire team, blades count as bolts, so one bolt and one blade is a duo bonus fire team, and if you're willing to spring the 3 extra points, the blade is also an engineer, willpower 12, but hey, it's about as good as it gets in this faction, while bringing close range gunfighting, tactical awareness, and being your engineer in a list in a faction that usually wants to have one engineer because tags are a major part of our game plan. You can also fire team a blade as a wild card with Squalos or Maximus, which was very, very powerful in N4, but actually has kind of been overshadowed a little bit in N5, because as good as a blade op is, particularly the engineer profile, bringing an engineer, you're mostly only going to take the blade op because you need an engineer and are willing to upgrade an alternate wildcard. And that alternate wildcard is the Pathfinder Dronbot. Now, you can put 2 Pathfinders in any fire team in this faction, which means that you can get duo bonuses just by slapping a pair of 17-point Pathfinders into a fire team. And the total package that you get, even for just one of these guys, is worth a lot more than 17 points. Actually, to the point where, given my druthers, this is borderline a piece that might want a little bit of developer balance attention at some point in future, because there's just so much utility. Firstly, it's 17-point tactical awareness wildcard. That alone would be incredible. That's a whole extra tactical awareness order for a tag that's running around the board or a fire team that's going forward and doing important things. There are some very significant models that it's very good to be able to deliver into the enemy. And a significant portion of Neoterra's real sure feat of orders in many army lists comes from Pathfinders. But beyond that, it's a Willpower 13 specialist, and it just has the whole Pathfinder suite. It's got a sensor and forward observer and a deactivator, and it's a repeater, and especially sensor and deactivator. If your opponent is relying on asymmetric defenses, if they're throwing out mine dispensers or laying mines, you can just spend some orders and you have those to spare because of tactical awareness and just clean all of that up. And that makes the Pathfinder a really valuable part of an integrated approach as Neoterra. You have very big guns to do very big gun things, but sooner or later something has to move into the midfield. And we have some viable close assault pieces, but we don't necessarily want to waste those on a minefield, and so the Pathfinder clears that way. And with the Pathfinder finding the path for our specialist or close assault elements, there's really nothing that we can't accomplish with this faction given a sufficient amount of orders time and maybe a little bit of good luck. And that's just very powerful. You should probably have at least one Pathfinder in every Neoterra list because the overall utility package is so high. And you should pretty much always be able to find something valuable for it to do that justifies the points cost. Now, for my money, the actual change I would kind of like to see here is just to have the tactical awareness one, like introduce FTO tags so that we don't get to just windmill slam tactical awareness into every link team in our entire army. But that's a change that the developers chose to make to other factions and didn't make to Pan-Oceania, so we have full permission to enjoy it for now. Now, speaking of those kind of pieces that are very good at capitalizing at space created by your big guns, but which you don't necessarily want to expend on a minefield, we really do need to mention Shona Carano. She is also a wildcard, and she is easily the best close combat model in the entire faction, and one of the better close combat models in the entire game. Infinity's ITS packs have a long history of including one or two scenarios each year that warrant the application of anti-material CCWs, and Shona Carano is possibly the best anti-material CCW in the game, or at least it's quite close. And just generally, if your opponent is dug in and hiding and you need to send someone after them, a Pathfinder to clear the way of any mines and then Shona Carano to close into close combat is just a very clean way of ensuring kills. While she doesn't want to risk mines because she isn't shock immune, she is very good at dodging in under things like flamethrowers, dodging on 17s, and if she gets into close combat, she's CC23, Martial Arts 4, with just an absolute cannon of a sword, AP explosive damage 4. She has super jump for mobility and doing things like getting onto rooftops where enemies might be hiding, and she is absolutely no good at anything else. She does not gunfight, she does not push buttons, she's a 22-point model that a fire team delivers up the field to kill something that is hiding from your guns. And for 22 points, that is valuable. In some scenarios, that is valuable. And so while she doesn't go into every single list, she's a great piece to have in the back pocket. Now, a few other models just to speed through. Bulletier Armbots can be part of a fire team as a wild card. The Spitfire is particularly interesting because it's a lower cost, lower SWC gun that, for example, you can follow around with a blade. Not for every list, ultimately not an enormously efficient package, but pretty efficient, pretty useful. Does still tend to impinge just a bit on your total points cost in a way that begins to edge out some much more expensive pieces, and we like those expensive pieces, but very good to have access to as a flex slot in some lists. Hannibal is a recent addition and a little bit of a meme pick, because mostly what he does is be a Pathfinder but worse. He doesn't have a deactivator, but he does have tactical awareness, and he can be a quite serviceable close assault piece if needed, and can be difficult to unpick in the reactive turn. We have a sure feat of interesting tactical awareness pieces in this faction. You could definitely be forgiven for exchanging, for example, a blade for Hannibal. In some cases, you could even exchange a Pathfinder for Hannibal, although I would say that last one would be rare. Alternatively, just take a bunch of all of them and have so many orders you don't know what to do with them. Hannibal does have the advantage, like a blade, of counting as a bolt, and so there's some fire teams that he might unlock that you couldn't accomplish just by windmill slamming Pathfinders in because of that fire team keywording. Finally, the Pan-Oceanian Blackfriar is an interesting element, particularly these days now that Albedo is actually kind of useful. The Thunderbolt and the Heavy Rocket Launcher are the most appealing profiles. Both of them can wildcard into any fire team and actually make a quite good model to join a pair of Fusiliers. If you want a firepower piece in a Fusilier link, this is where I would go for that. But ultimately, Albedo is still a niche enough rule in N5 that I would consider the Panosianian Blackfriar to be a sometimes pick. Remember that you have him in your army. Keep him in mind when you're doing list construction, and definitely feel free to slot him in from time to time as a hate piece if you have a regular opponent who is doing something that he'd be very good at countering. But for general use, going to be somewhat meta dependent. Now, finally, just to mention him, Fusilier Indigo Richard Quinn. Now, there are some upsides to this profile. MSV1 and Warhorse makes him very good at ignoring modifiers, although he's going to fundamentally struggle to capitalize on that with just marksman rifles and multi-rifles as his armament. He is also expensive in all three profiles for a single wound model, but he is at least a forward observer. The reason why we will sometimes consider Quinn in lists is because of this third profile here. Multi-rifle flash pulse decharges, don't care, disco baller. The only other disco in this faction is very, very expensive. Literally twice the cost of Quinn, and Quinn is expensive as is. Usually, I am going to suggest probably leaving him at home, but he is something to bear in mind that exists in the faction, because sometimes a list just warrants having access to 0 visibility zones, and if you want access to those in Neoterra, the cheapest way to get it, albeit still expensive, is 26 points for Quinn. Now, okay, we're done talking about the meat and potatoes. We're done talking about the link teams and the infrastructure and the stuff that you take to support all of the cool shit. 35 minutes into this video, let's talk about the cool shit, and that must begin with, well, two profiles, both of which are of equal prominence in NCA's hierarchy of top shelf badass motherfuckers, the Clausewitz Ulan. And boy howdy has it taken a lot of additions for that to be true, because in no prior edition of the game was the Clausewitz Ulan more than, at best, maybe playable as something of a vanity pick. Not in N5. This guy is one of the best tags in the game. Now, firstly, and obviously, he has the coolest regiment name of any model in the game. But setting aside that purely aesthetic concern, this guy is Infinity's equivalent of a tank destroyer and is fantastically well equipped to be an active turn firepower superiority piece. The profile that you will basically always want to take is the 70-point ballistic skill attack +1 burst profile, not because the 80-point profile is bad, but because it's 10 points cheaper to pay 70 points. If you have all of these points spare, yep, the AP Heavy Rocket Launcher +1 burst can be genuinely terrifying because it's a continuous damage armor-piercing template weapon. It can burn things to the ground, but never in any list that I have written for Neoterra in N5 have I ever had 10 points spare for a luxury pick. There is always something you can do with that instead, and so no, take the 70.1 by default. And what we get for those 70 points are a Burst 3 Ballistic Skill 15 Feuerback. Okay, that's pretty damn good. It has Mimetism -3 and Warhorse, and my goodness, Warhorse is a hell of a thing on this tag. It has all of the usual tag special rules, and it has Camouflage. And Camouflage is the really important bit here. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that, like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, I'm going to use it for ambush purposes, and I'm going to jump out of camouflage and take an ARO, or, like, I'll get active turn surprise attack. And you might do any of those things. You might use the Clausewitz as an ARO piece. You will, from time to time, use surprise attack. But the actual utility of camouflage is that at the end of every one of your turns, and during deployment, you go into that marker state, and you can't be attacked until you're discovered. That means you are not subject to possession, you are not subject to hacking. An enemy that gets into your backfield, you have effective 360-degree line of sight, and more importantly, they have to discover you before they can do anything to you. And all of that is for the purpose of making sure that when the active turn rolls around, you still have your Clausewitz. And that is incredibly important because this guy's 1.5 SWC and 70 points, you cannot afford to lose him to enemy active turn firepower. I like the Squalos. We will talk about the Squalos in a little bit. The Squalos is a good tag, but the Squalos can be neutralized by the enemy in their turn, and the Clausewitz much of the time just can't, which means it's a tag, provided you're willing to be like, nope, I'm going to be disciplined here, this thing is not taking AROs until round 3. Provided you are willing to do that, the Clausewitz is always a tag who is there for you in active turn, which means it is probably the best insurance in the entire faction against being locked out of the game due to running out of guns. And so just in addition to all of the really cool things that it does, the negative modifiers that it can stack, how powerful its ammunition is, the fact that it's frankly not that bad at close range with the multi-pistol, having goddamn Warhorse on this piece, I really don't know why it has that rule. All of that is fantastic, but the most valuable thing about Clausewitz, about the Ulans, is that they will be there for your active turn, and in Neoterra, that is enormously, enormously valuable. You will see one of these guys in the list at the end of this video, and for very, very good reason. One of my favorite profiles in the sectoral, and they're one of these things about Neoterra that is just really inherently Neoterran, because 70 points, get that into this list. Will we struggle to hit 15 troopers? Absolutely not, because all of that underlying infrastructure is there. This is a faction where you can take the Clausewitz Ulan and you make maybe one or two little tweaks and you still get everything else that you want into a list. Excellent model, excellent tag, and a strength of the faction. And the second really defining strength of the faction, big kid in the playground, and regiment that is home to literally the best ARO piece in the entire game, the Swiss Guard. Now, if you have been playing Infinity for any length of time, you will probably be familiar with this. It is the archetypical mimetism -6 camouflage heavy infantry. Super elite. More expensive than many tags, but you get for that price tag ballistic skill 15, armor 5, BTS 6, surprise attack, mimetism, hidden deployment, camouflage. All of that is excellent. Now there are a grab bag of profiles here, many of which are kind of appealing. The killer hacking profile is kind of cool and interesting. The heavy machine gun is nice and reliable, but there is one profile that we are particularly interested in and which is our go-to. The Swiss Guard light shotgun missile launcher +1 special die. There is no model in the game that is scarier dropping out of hidden deployment to take an ARO than this piece, and in fact it's so dangerous that you can just turn this model on as an active turn firepower piece and it will generally suffice. Your opponent may have an idea that it's coming, but it always takes the first shot on its own terms, and it is so good at gunfighting that there's just perilously few models in the game that can even reliably beat it at a gunfight. It has the highest ballistic skill in the game, it has the most mimetism you can have on a model, and it's throwing 2 dice back at you, and on the off chance that it does lose a face-to-face roll, it has good, robust survivability stats. This thing can just toilet bowl entire games. If it just appears in the wrong place at the wrong time and takes an ARO that gets a kill and then can't be dislodged, cool. Firepower superiority in ARO. That is a rare thing in Infinity. Even post-October 2025, when a bunch of models, including the Swiss Guard, got given a little boost for ARO power, and AROs became kind of a little bit better, a little bit more able to contend with the best firepower in the game, it was still pretty rare to see ARO pieces that would just win gunfights. The Swiss Guard is an exception. It can and it will, and it is just so very powerful. And as I said, you should feel free to use this thing in active turn. Yes, it's only throwing 2 dice, but it's a missile launcher. It only needs to win one hit needs to land for it to kill its target most of the time. And with ballistic skill 15 and surprise attack and mimetism, most of the time you can land a hit. You just fire this thing off in active turn, roll 2 dice, score, oh, I rolled a 12, your opponent can't beat that. Take 3 saves with a template weapon, take 3 saves armor piercing. The Swiss Guard is usable as an active turn piece in addition to being the best ARO piece in the game, and for that reason, yeah, 60 points is a price that I am willing to pay. Now, it is difficult, not impossible, but difficult to fit a Swiss Guard and an Ulan in the same list. Ultimately, we're usually going to be constrained. There will be some other things that we will want. That's a very one-dimensional list that is spending 130 points on 2 models, neither of which can really press a button. Yes, technically the Ulan does have its Crabot, but so in most lists, the Swiss Guard and the Ulan are destined to be forever apart, although credit to you if you make that work as a list. It does sound terrifying, but either of these two, the Ulan or the Swiss Guard, are defining factional strengths of Neoterra and just like really, 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 really good. Frankly, it's probably for the best that the Swiss Guard, as it is now, only ever existed in N5, because there's some people I'm aware of that would have just crashed out of the game if they played against this thing when they were playing Infinity. Now, the super cool stuff to spend your points in SWC on in Neoterra does not end with a Premier Tag and a Premier Heavy Infantry, because we also get a Premier Vehicle in the form of the Red Eye Close Air Support Squad. Now, I am on record as saying the Red Eye is not my favorite vehicle, but it is up there, and I consider it very good, and it fits very well in Neoterra. Remember, this is a faction where we have, particularly with the Clausewitz Ulan, a pretty good chance of always having a nice good quality active turn firepower piece, which means we have a pretty good chance of always being able to suppress our enemy's active turn AROs. And if you can suppress your enemy's active turn AROs, vehicles are really good. There's basically two things a Red Eye doesn't want to deal with. It doesn't want to deal with really high quality long range gunfighting that zones out its Spitfire, and it doesn't want to deal with having to push into a hacking defense against which it is moderately vulnerable. Provided it doesn't really have to fight either of those two things, this is a scourge of the midfield because it has a sensor, and it's a scourge of enemy deployment zones if it pushes far enough forward to take those fights. And with 11 inches on the first short move skill, if you have put down the enemy AROs that might contest its advance, it can make that close the gap play very, very quickly, and then start taking jumping shots and plunging fire down into enemy deployment zone positions, which can just end the game very, very quickly. Most people at this stage are beginning to get a figure for how to defend against vehicles, mostly in terms of the sacrifices that need to be made, but even that tends to mean that the existence or potential existence of a Red Eye forces your opponent to put guns on ARO, and if your opponent is putting guns on ARO, then there is food for the Ulan. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, which creates a whole that is collectively very powerful. On top of that, in Neoterra, the Red Eye is, I believe, the only Silhouette 7 model, which means it does get its choice of premium places to hide in the reactive turn, which really shores up one of the biggest weaknesses about it. And finally, the grenade launcher is something that I just really like having access to. Some spec fire in Panachenia, even though, frankly, a Red Eye does not usually need a grenade launcher because it just goes and kills the things that you might spec fire, nevertheless a nice tool to have if you have the one extra point. This is a faction where I speak very highly of the Red Eye, and we will in fact see a Red Eye in the list at the end of this video. Now, continuing on with cool things to spend your SWC on, if we talk about the Red Eye, we should at least mention the Garuda, but if you'd like my opinion on the Garuda, I invite you to go and take a look at my video on flyers. Now, I will actually say, in Neoterra, because there is so little contesting the spaces that a Silhouette 7 model might hide, and because the Red Eye is muscular in terms of its ability to endure fire, I'm actually reasonably comfortable probably recommending the Red Eye over a Garuda in many lists. The durability and psychological effect and the threat that the Red Eye has, forcing your opponent to contend with it and therefore put AROs up that you therefore get to kill, has potentially a collectively higher effect. But if you want to make a smaller investment, because the Garuda is a full 12-13 points cheaper than a Red Eye, the Garuda Spitfire is a really cool piece that does basically everything the Red Eye does in terms of active turn firepower, but with higher mobility and at a lower cost. Higher mobility, what do you mean by that? It doesn't have super jump plus 1 inch. No, it doesn't, but it is Silhouette 2. Because it's Silhouette 2, it can start and end in more places. And on top of that, it has both Parachutist and Super Jump, Parachutist being the most reliable one, which just gets it in off the table edge in places your opponent didn't see. A Garuda is better for a sucker punch, but a Red Eye tends to be better for forcing your opponent to try and contest it, killing them, and then just punching them directly with the Red Eye in any case. Both very, very good. You can easily downgrade to a Garuda, and while I prefer the Garuda over the Red Eye in general terms for being a flyer and doing flyer things, the total effect of the Red Eye, if you can afford it, may be a little higher in Neoterra. Up next, we have the Hexa Strategic Security Division, and this is a fascinating and interesting piece. My personal preference here is the multi-sniper, but it is worth noting that you're getting a few interesting things with this. We do have access to hacking and killer hacking profiles and even a Spitfire, but because this model has hidden deployment and camouflage but not infiltration, the sniper is just kind of the cleanest option, and we get, with that sniper, ballistic skill 13, hidden deployment, camouflage, mimetism -6, and interestingly, counterintelligence. Now, counterintelligence has been updated in October 2025 to work even if the model using it is hidden deployed, and that's just one more arrow in the quiver of the high order count Neoterra list, and it's just kind of cool and interesting to have. It's also a model that is fine on its merits. Ballistic skill 13 usually means you'll land one hit, the enemy will often struggle to respond against the negative mods you're applying, and then this is a really high damage weapon, damage 4 with double action rounds, which is just really solid, particularly in scenarios that warrant longer range bands, radial deployment scenarios. If you would like to take a Swiss Guard but kinda can't afford it but want to spook your opponent anyway, a Hexa is something that you can consider, although be aware that if you declare counterintelligence, you will give away that the missing piece is a Hexa. A cool thing overall, not in the same realms of power as the pieces we were discussing previously, but a good and interesting unit and fun to have access to. Carrying on with our cool stuff to spend SWC on, we then get finally to the Squalos Mark II Pan-Oceanian Armored Cavalry Heavy Lancers. These guys are good. They're a good tag, and the only thing they suffer for is that they exist in the same faction as a Clausewitz Ulan, at not too many points less than a Clausewitz Ulan. The big advantage of the Squalos is that they can be linked, either with each other. You often would find something like a multi-HMG or the regular HMG duoed with the multi-marksman rifle. That is very sound. It's a build your own HRMC in at least one of these cases, and NCO gets you extra orders. Or they can be linked with a blade if you want an engineer, or a pathfinder if you want more utility for cheaper, because pathfinders are obscene. And all of that should be, and look, frankly, realistically is, a faction defining strength, except that a Clausewitz Ulan and a Swiss Guard are just so good. And so I've been helping a friend write Neoterran lists and come up with ideas for Neoterran lists coming up to a satellite event. And we've gone back and forth and back and forth. And I think there have been 3 or 4 lists that he sent through where it's like, hey, what if a Squalos in this list? And we've both looked at it and gone, no, you should take an Ulan. It's just that much better. And while that is an assessment that I stand by, there are still list archetypes that you can make with Neoterra where, especially if you're like, you know what, I just want more than 20 orders in this list. I just want to roll up to the table and throw down this order pool and have my opponent go, that can't possibly be legal, and be like, yep, bitch, that's an NCO and 4 tactical awareness orders. And that's basically the archetype in which the Squalos thrives. Or if you want more orders and are willing to lean back off the quality a little bit, and you've got other ways to make that up, there are lists that you can run that include a Squalos that are totally fine. It's just that relative to the probably undercosted, slightly overpowered 70-point Ulan and 60-point Swiss missile launcher, right, those just absolutely premium pieces, a Squalos is a bit more normal in every respect except for how many orders it lets you bomb into a list. I do like them. I have a soft spot for them. I really like them in N4. In N5, overshadowed just slightly, but still very solid. Finally, in terms of premium quality pieces, we should mention Max and the Aquilla Guard. There, I've mentioned Max. Now let's talk about the Aquilla Guard. A little bit like the Blackfriar, the Aquilla Guard is a sometimes piece that mostly struggles by being compared to other things, not so much in his SWC bracket as in his points bracket. 52 to 49 points is very expensive, and if your opponent isn't bringing things that the multispectral visor level 3 is really good against, he is just a very glorified orc. And that means that best case scenario, the Aquilla Guard is maybe in one of your 2 lists. If, for example, you're playing in a meta where there's a very good Tartary Army Corps or Ariadne player, for example, you might in that situation choose to bring an Aquilla because of how powerful the MSV3 is in very specific matchups. Now, the most direct application of that MSV3, of that ballistic skill 15, is obviously the heavy machine gun. The multi-marksman is an interesting profile. All 3 of them are basically the same. They are all specialists. They all have a damage 6 multi-marksman. That is still not an incredibly powerful gun, but it is ballistic skill 15 with an MSV3. All 3 of them are specialists. All 3 of them have ballistic skill 15 disco balls, and all 3 of them are wild cards. And that makes them, for me, a little bit of an uncharted territory, because I am not sure myself how they fit into what I want to do with this faction. I've spoken at length about how I want to play the Pan-Oceanian game, how I want to obtain firepower superiority, put the enemy down, advance pieces forward that want to advance under covering fire, and the Aquilla Guard FTO specialist profiles are kind of the antithesis of that. They are very good disco and medium range firepower and specialists themselves, which technically makes these profiles kind of a fire team in a can. And it's easy to imagine a team that you can build that you slot these guys into, even if that team is one Fusilier, two Pathfinder drone bots, and an Aquilla, and you leave the Fusilier behind and just walk forward with a quote-unquote Fusilier fire team consisting of an Aquilla and two Pathfinders for tack-aware orders and the +1 special die, and it's not playing the game that Neoterra otherwise is. Now that inherently makes it interesting, and Strategos 1 is a valuable skill that is otherwise completely absent in Panosiania, so that makes it interesting. And all of this contributes to my recommendation for the Aquilla Guard being you should probably try it out at some point if you play a bunch of this faction. It's not going to appear in the list at the end of this video, and I don't have confidence in a positive appraisal of it. 52 points is an awful lot for a multi-marksman rifle, but it might be the beginning of a completely different kind of Neoterra list, and if you're watching this and you're a Neoterra player, there's probably got to be something there to explore. Hell, a list with 2 Aquila guards has high watermark visibility control, and that's weird. And so while I don't recommend it if you are getting into Neoterra, and I don't recommend it as a reason to get into Neoterra, once you've played a bunch of Neoterra with all of the pieces that I've spent the last quarter of an hour splooging over, this guy is my pick for something to investigate. See if it works, see if there's something there. Test this, because it's doing something fundamentally different to the rest of the faction, and that's fascinating. Now, just to round this video out, because the Aquila Guard, normally at the end of these videos, before we get to the list, I talk about things that are interesting to try. That's the Aquila Guard. Like, try the Aquila Guard. It's the weird and interesting thing. But there are 3 profiles that I just wanted to mention because they didn't really fit in anywhere else, and the first of those is the Deva Functionary. It's a 20-point killer hacker with willpower 15, BTS 3, immunity to isolated, and no wounding cap. Cha-ching! One of the best value KHDs in the game, and it is willpower 15 killer hacking. Remember all of that discussion that we had about how good a blocker was as the start of a hacking network? This is the second element that you put into a list if you wanted to have some hacking dominance. A Deva is not going to kill particularly. It can fight, but it doesn't really want to fight something like Deferson. But against anyone else that's just like, I bought 2 hackers just to have some hacking in this game, because hacking's cool, a Deva punches down into that very effectively. And she's a specialist, and she has no wounding cap, and she has a boarding shotgun. And so if you want to reach what I talked about, that top of the middleweight bracket of hacking, then you've spent 19 points on a blocker and 20 points on a Deva, 2 troopers, average cost just under 20 points per model. That is totally reasonable and totally affordable, and it's very cool to have access to that kind of thing. Not for every list, because not every Pan-Oceanian list needs to have access to decent quality hacking, but you've got it these days in Neoterra, so fill your boots from time to time. Next up, just to mention it, Armbot Peacemakers. They're really good. They contribute well to a hacking game, they are mine layers and midfield, they have Oxbot, many thing Rob-like, good to put in list. Not obligatory, and particularly in Neoterra, if we're taking some forward observer auxilia, we have closer in crumple zone defensive pieces. And so there's less need to stop the enemy or begin to absorb the enemy's attention, 20 inches from the back of the table edge. We can rely a little bit if we need to on the Oxbots in our DZ to guard the close approaches. But a Peacemaker Armbot is still good, and you want to lean towards the Mine Layer Oxbot. It gets you 3 things in the midfield. It's just useful and valuable. Put them in your Neoterra lists. Finally, just to mention it, the Locust, the only skirmisher in this faction. Not quite infiltration, but pretty close. We have forward deploying, hidden deployment specialist. Cool, that's pretty useful. This is a weird grab bag of profiles. The Wild Parrot is interesting. Usually I would recommend one of the specialist operatives of some sort. And at 28 or 30 points, these guys are pricey, but they're a borderline midfield ballistic skill 12 pitcher and hacker with firewalls, and who, thanks to mimetism and reasonable ballistic skill, are okay at gunfighting. And I think the killer hacker kind of takes the cake here, specifically because the killer hacker has a marker state, which means you can have the Locust hide under hidden deployment, reveal on its own terms, and then unlike the hacker with hacking device or the hacker with single-used camouflage, you can re-enter a marker state if you need to. That makes the 28-point Locust KHD kind of my pick if you're looking for a midfield specialist, and there are plenty of scenarios where you are. Hardlock in particular is one that can really aggressively be swung by a specialist on the final turn that emerges from hidden deployment, and while 28 points is difficult to keep off the field, constituting almost 10% of your army, if that 10% of your army wins you the game, quite worthwhile. Not going to feature in too many of the lists that I write for Neoterra, but mostly because of its uniqueness needed to be mentioned. And with that, let's take a look at a list that pulls together a bunch of the concepts that we've talked about. And this is a list that tries to make as few compromises as possible, but does inevitably make some in the interests of getting basically everything that we've talked about with high praise that we can into this list. Now, this is an Ulan list. It's not a Swiss Guard list. If you wanted to save 10 points and do something interesting, you could 100% trade the Ulan out for a Swiss Guard. That will let you do something like turn the Tech Bee into something different and would still be eminently serviceable. I wanted to do an Ulan list, and so an Ulan list we shall have. Looking at Combat Group 2 first, we have an Ulan, an Auxilla Forward Observer, a Deva KHD, a Tech B, and 2 Fugazi drone bots. That makes this a 7-order combat group, and frankly, you could realistically consider pulling a Fugazi drone bot into Group 2, because one of the things this list never wants to do is have one too few orders for the Ulan. You don't want to find yourself in situations where the Ulan has to choose between recamouflaging or killing the thing that's stopping you from advancing. And so the group size here is your mileage may vary. If you play this list yourself, test. 7 orders on the Ulan if I think I need it and it's my reserve drop should generally be enough, but you could absolutely be forgiven for rejigging this and just being like, nope, the Ulan goes in the biggest possible combat group because I always want to have orders on it if I need them. Something just to consider. I wanted to maximize 2 separate groups at the same time, but I am wearing some risk by doing so in the hopes that the reward is worthwhile. If there is nothing for the Ulan to shoot, thumbs up, we proceed on to doing all of the things we get to do with this list when the enemy isn't contesting our advance, and one of the things that we would do is just move the Auxilla forward, for example. If the Ulan has no order output, the Auxilla can move forward, it can lay deployable repeaters, it can press buttons, it can push up to the midfield. It's even surprisingly good at discovering things because 2 discover rolls is good, like etc. Use this combat group to press buttons and establish a hacking network if the Ulan has nothing to do, but as a general rule, I would expect the Ulan has something to do most turns. As a reminder, it's very, very important that the Ulan stays alive during your reactive turn. You don't want it getting isolated or immobilized or possessed or even just shot up. Always recamouflage it, and if you can, don't take AROs. Sometimes you may have no choice. Sometimes maybe fucking Van Zant walks onto your backfield and the only thing that can stop him is an Ulan dropping out of camouflage and firing an explosive round. If that's the case, then that's the case. But as a rule, you want to keep this thing hidden because it is a primary part of your firepower dominance plan in the active turn. And when we look at Group 1, we can see one of the first things we want to do, taking advantage of firepower dominance, we have the Red Eye. It's very fast, it's very dangerous. There are multiple sources of sensor in this list, which is something that I quite like. It can scoop through the midfield if it needs to. But what you're mostly looking to do is just present a threat to your opponent that says, if you put no guns on ARO, I'm going to move, or jump, move, and then start shooting your deployment zone with this red eye. So you better put some guns on ARO to contest its advance, and then you kill those with the class wits. You do need to give this thing priority in terms of not necessarily reserve deployment, but when you deploy this in your deployment zone, it has to be in total cover, all of the usual vehicle rules. You can then go ahead and win games with the red eye because of how aggressive and dangerous and mobile it is. The rest of the list functions in support of it. We then have the first of a couple of fire teams. We have a Bolt MSV1, can be used as an ARO piece if need be. If you do that, maximize the advantage of its range bands. You don't ever want to take fair fights with a single wound piece. A Blade FTO, now we've got the Blade in here, it could be a Pathfinder. The Pathfinder would for most practical purposes be kind of better, except we need something to give the Bolt duo bonuses, and there's an Ulan in this list, and I have scrimped on engineers otherwise, and so the Blade is picking up the slack there. You do need to bear that in mind. The Ulan is sometimes going to need the Blade's support, but we should have enough orders on this team if we need to reposition and repair. We don't want to, but it is an option. We don't want to be relying on Tech B Gizmo kits to try and recover an Ulan. Yes, you can do it. It's not ideal. So the blade is our compromise to make sure that there is an engineer, so we can keep the Ulan topped up if we need to. We then have Shona Carano and a Pathfinder. Now, the Pathfinder doesn't actually have to be stabled to this fire team, but Shona Carano is present. In a sense, you don't need her in a list that has a Red Eye. The Red Eye gives you a rapid offensive unit that can take advantage of a breakthrough and strafe through the midfield or kill your opponent in the deployment zone. Shona is here mostly because I want this list to be nice and well-rounded, and having some close assault just gives you the option of playing more parts of the game. She's also really good in a scenario like corporate appropriation, although realistically we do have that basically taken care of. We've got the blade with decharges if we need it, and you can always do something like have an Auxilla and its Oxbot pull decharges out of a panoply. She's probably the closest thing to a pet piece in this scenario, but given that she can absolutely crank anything that she gets in contact with, nice and worth having. And because we have 2 tactical awareness orders on this fire team if we want it, she's very easy to deliver into the midfield and then potentially even pull back with the other pieces and just leave her to go and do her business. We've then got the 2 Fusiliers, a lieutenant and a decoy. If I had more points, it would be nice to turn them into Auxilla. For example, if the Ulan was a Swiss Guard, both of those could become regular Auxilla, and then I'd have a couple of Oxbots. That would be nice. But in this list, since I have them, they're going to be forming a Haris team. The Bolt team will be the core of 2 Fusiliers and a blocker. The lieutenant will usually stay behind if they need to move forward, but what that gives me is very good network projection and a hacker to take advantage of all of my hacking devices. Finally, we have the 3rd Fugazi drone board. Now, just something to note with this setup, there's no baggage in this list, and that's somewhat of a conscious choice because I'm not hugely concerned about blowing all of the pitches with a blocker on the first round, for example. I could reload theoretically with Speedball if I needed to, but we've got other sources of deployable repeater in this list. We've got both the Tech B and the Auxilla, which means that if it's a game where hacking is relevant, actually we're not doing too badly in terms of getting repeaters down. Now, if you tweaked the list, if for example you were willing to play without an engineer, or if you thought you didn't need Shona, there's all sorts of adjustments that we could very easily make. We could make the blade into a cheaper bolt. That'd save 4 points. We could then get Shona Carano. We could turn her into a Peacemaker Mine Layer. That would free up, even with that change, that being more expensive, that would free up enough points to get access to a baggage bot. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that you could do here. This is just pieces that I wanted to include, pieces that I thought were cool. I wanted to show the full spectrum of what can be done with a Neoterra list, and I think we've kind of succeeded with that, because when we look at this, we've got the vehicle, we've got sniper gunfighting, we've got a whole bunch of orders. This is an 18 order list, even if you don't spend the LT order. We have multiple sources of sensor, we have multiple specialists, we've got multiple hackers, including a regular hacker and a killer hacker, a very good killer hacker, with excellent network projection. We've got some very good gunfighting between the Bolt and the Ulan and the Red Eye when the time is right. There's just a bunch of stuff going on here. This is just a really solid list. I really like this list. And in addition to all of that, it's all regular. There's no irregular orders in this list. It is literally a 15 order plus 3 tactical awareness order list, and that's super cool. This is a really, really good faction. It's full of power pieces. It's full of pieces that are very good at their jobs, and it is a list that abides by Karl von Clausewitz's advice that the best strategy is just always to be very strong. Thanks, Karl. Good tip. And with that wisdom, that wraps up our video for today. Hope you've enjoyed this faction focus. Thanks once again to all of the channel members who voted for it. Neoterra is a faction that's near and dear to my heart, and good to be able to talk about them in N5 with their return. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by becoming a member on YouTube or via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. We put Infinity videos out about once a week. We cover tournaments, faction focuses, battle reports, and do the occasional dive into more esoteric topics, all of which you can find on the channel. For now, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next week for more Infinity content.